Let's get to the point. Our first topic today, the $700 billion bailout doesn't seem to be having the immediate effect that President Bush had hoped for. The highly unstable U.S. economy is having a trickle-down effect on the world economy, and many are talking about a worldwide recession. Who is responsible for this economic meltdown, and is there a clear path out of this financial disaster? First, Matt, I want to start, before you answer the question, I want you to describe for people who do not understand the bailout, what exactly was the bailout supposed to do and what is it?
Well, I'm not sure the bailout can be explained entirely. It's also shifting to some degree. Paulson, Secretary of Treasury Paulson, is reserving the right to make some adjustments as he goes along. But basically, the idea is to take the $700 billion or so and buy up the mortgages, the distressed mortgages, or the packages of mortgages that banks and other creditors are holding that may have potential foreclosures within them. That's the problem. Is these are all securities that people have used to gain collateral for other things, and once a creditor or somebody who might potentially loan a bank or someone money doesn't know what that's worth, they won't give them any money for it. So the government is offering essentially to buy up all these homes, which will amount to buying probably hundreds of thousands of homes, perhaps even millions of home mortgages. And then the idea, theoretically, and it's certainly possible because when we look at previous bailouts, they have been fairly successful for the taxpayers. The idea is that potentially, because the government can wait and hold these loans for long periods of time, or even if they have to foreclose, they can hold the property for a long period of time and wait till the real estate market rebounds and then sell the homes. The idea is that over time, most, if not all, of that money will probably come back to the Treasury as those homes are sold. These mortgages have value. They just don't have value right now because nobody knows how many of them are going to go into foreclosure. And none of the people who currently own them in the market want to hold them for a long period of time. But the government is willing to hold them for a long period of time. So that is essentially the idea behind the bailout. In answer to your question, I'm not convinced that what the President and Secretary Paulson were trying to do was meant to have an immediate effect on the market. I don't think there was a way to have an immediate effect on the market because the market was reacting to a problem that the government was responsible for creating over a very long period of time. And there's really nothing you can do in a week or two that's going to convince them that things are going to get better right away.
Well, I don't believe the government was wholly responsible for what was going on. I think greed and, as Greenspan put it, and I blame him for part of the process, irrational exuberance, where people were selling these derivatives and bundled up all this nice stuff, and then they got AAA ratings, even though they should have never gotten AAA ratings. From my point of view, the private sector is just as culpable as the public sector that didn't oversee what was going on.
Well, we have a strong disagreement on this because I want to be clear that this all starts with the fact that there are a whole bunch of home loans in the system that are likely to be foreclosure or bankruptcies. People who own homes who really had no potential long-term to be able to stay in those homes because of their income. That occurred because systematically over the course of a couple of decades, the federal government not just encouraged banks to make these loans zero down, 80-20s, those kinds of things, but actually required them to do it. The Community Reinvestment Act literally threatened banks and their federal status if they did not go and make these very, very risky loans. Now, the way the government did that was by guaranteeing them.
I had an actual situation in the 90s where my company was hired to do an assessment of the loan policies at one of the local major banks. And I said, well, okay, you want me to compare qualified potential borrowers who are African American against qualified potential borrowers who are Caucasian. And they said, no, we want you to throw them all into one heap. And I said, but if you look at it, like qualified African Americans default at no greater rate than qualified Caucasians. But if you take unqualified African Americans, they default at a greater rate than qualified Caucasians. In other words, they said, we don't want you to compare qualified people to qualified people. We just want to know, do African Americans get turned down more often, or do they fail more often than Caucasians? And I said, well, yeah, if you don't compare their qualifications, they might at a higher rate. And they said, well, that's the information we need to take to the feds so that we can then qualify for additional loan options.
And I just want to finish this thought, though. The government wanted this to happen. So what it did, in the way that only the government can, is it said, all right, make these loans. We know they're high risk, but we will back them. So essentially they became federally guaranteed. Well, with that, Nellie bar the door, the banks went crazy giving out loans because they all make a percentage on, home loans and that kind of thing. Everybody in the home loan business gets a percentage every time a home loan is given. And when the government said, we will back basically any loan you write, people went crazy. Now, is that greed? Absolutely, it's greed. But it was unleashed by the government saying, we will back this all up.
I'm telling you, I mean, mortgage brokers, when I was looking to buy a house, they were all over themselves with all kinds of creative ways to get you into, especially in California where the homes are so expensive. If you had something called a jumbo loan, jumbo loans, they didn't want to give them out, so they would give you one loan for an amount under $1 million or whatever it was, and then you'd get a second to pay for the rest, to sort of just hide that whole fact, and then get an interest-only loan that you would never be able to pay off.
Many of these very risky loans would never have been made in a market system without the government backing them. I mean, banks would not have made those loans if the government hadn't said, we will guarantee it if you do. And
unfortunately, not all the banks did that. If you take a look at local smaller banks, they kept doing the same thing. They made sure the people had the amount of money down needed to really get into the loan, that they had the financial wherewithal to actually buy the house and keep paying the mortgage. So your smaller local banks definitely kept what I consider to be the irrational exuberance out of their loan portfolio, which is why they're not in default.
And the crazy thing is, the people in default represent a very small percentage of the mortgages.
Right.
Only 70% of homes have mortgages, and of those, about 90-some% are performing.
That's right.
So it's a really small percentage of the bad mortgages that are dragging the market
And
down.
I have to, historically, the Community Reinvestment Act was designed to stop major banks from redlining, saying, we take on the map and we draw a line around this neighborhood and we won't loan there, even though there may have been qualified people who could have met all the requirements for a standardized loan. They wouldn't loan the money there because they were in a less than desirable neighborhood.
Right, but as with all things, we took a real problem and solved it by creating another and going too far.
You have to look at the historical reason for that, and the historical reason was that you had a racist system that was going on, that if this was a neighborhood that was not, Caucasian, and they thought it wasn't going to be, we don't want that kind of business in our bank, that was the reason for the community relations.
Yes, but the problem was what ended up happening was the quotas. Essentially,
I'm not going to argue that.
As Mike said, nobody was asking about qualifications anymore. They just said, we expect you to meet a certain quota of minorities with homes. Meet the quota.
But all the
people
who were going into foreclosure are not minorities. That's the key.
That's true.
Absolutely not.
That's true. And it's not all about minorities, but it's about everybody in Washington wanting to be able to tout that home ownership was up. So they used the government to back loans that should never have been
look at
better.
it from a different point of view. Historically, I'll let you go next.
Maybe.
Is that after 9/11, the only thing going for the economy was the housing market. Between Mr. Greenspan and the Treasury, the Secretary, they knew that if they kept the interest rates down, artificially low, they would keep borrowing and buying houses. They would get seconds on their mortgage. They would then have a credit system that was becoming bloated, because that was the only thing that kept the economy, and ours is based on consumerism, going. If we had stopped right then and there and said, hey, even Greenspan himself said it was going crazy, but since he was a fan of derivatives and most of the stuff's going on, if somebody had stepped forward with basic common sense and said, it shouldn't be this way, we wouldn't be here today.